Hello, everyone. I'm Richard Schwartz from Global Custodian, and we're here to talk about the future of the post-trade industry, which is a very big topic, as you'll agree, and so we're probably going to take a fairly big picture view of this subject. I'm going to introduce the panelists, but I'm only going to introduce them with one of their job titles because they've all got lots and they all do lots of things. So on my left is Tom Zeeb, who is, amongst other things, the CEO of Securities services. We have Ganapathy Subramaniam, who luckily is known as NGS, that makes it easy, who's Chief Operating Officer of Tata Consulting Services, a provider of a lot of platforms to market infrastructures. We have Goucher from the Canadian Derivatives Clearing Corporation, which he runs, but he's also, are you chair of the Central Depository? Yeah. And then we have Chris Church, who I'm sure a lot of you know from his days at Swift, but who's actually Chief Business Development Officer now at Digital Asset Holdings, which is a company that if you don't know the name of the company, you'll certainly have heard the name of some of the things that they do that will come up. Somebody said, I'm not sure who it was, that the trouble with the future is that it usually arrives before we're ready for it. And we're going to try and prepare a little bit. But we're not, what I'm hoping for as a journalist is 4 strong visions that are somewhat incompatible. And then that'll make my job easier. If everyone agrees, I'll have to live with it, but I'm not expecting that. I'm going to divide this up into 4 areas that don't necessarily flow one into the other, but they're all things that have come up and that the speakers have mentioned as challenges that they have to deal with. One is obviously blockchain and DLT, and I've grouped that under new technology generally. We're not going to spend the whole session on it, but we'll give a chunk of the discussion to blockchain. Specifically, I was chatting with Chris yesterday, I think, and we agreed, I think, that a lot of the blockchain discussions tend to bounce around because on the panel you have this person who's been involved in a particular proof of concept and that person in a different proof of concept, and that person's further advanced but in a different area, and they all talk about their experiences, but it's hard to get a handle on the big picture with blockchain and what's actually being delivered now, soon, and in the future. So that's where that's going to go. Then there's the question of the adoption of new technologies and new processes. So often the technology's there, but getting the people to actually use it in the way that's most effective is hard because people don't necessarily like to change the way they do things. So that's another challenge we'll be looking at. A general industry issue, particularly in post-trade, is one of scale. Scale has been seen as the solution to a lot of the problems of driving down unit cost. But the question is now, are we getting diminishing returns from that process, given the size of the infrastructures we're talking about, and is there a better way to bring down cost for the industry? And then finally, we're going to look a bit more at collaboration and how do you get people across and along the value chain to work together to a common end, which will inevitably mean somebody's going to have to give up some of the stuff that they do. So that's the broad outline, and then we'll have 15 minutes or so at the end to ask questions. But if anyone says anything that you feel particularly outraged about, just heckle and we'll bring you in. So I'd like to start, though, with a question for Glenn, because you've also had some experience of the Canadian payments market and changes that are. Why is it that the payments industry seems so much further advanced in the use and implementation of new technologies than the securities industry? Or is that unfair? Good.
Well, I don't think it's unfair, and I think it depends on what you're comparing it to and who you're comparing it to. But I would say that as a country, we've been thoughtful about progressing with the payments arena and what can and can't be done as we modernize. We think about modernization around payments. That's helped in Canada by being a large, technology advanced country, but small in terms of the number of participants that have to be engaged in industry dialogues. So that comes with, the good side and the bad side of doing that, but it allows you to think about things that are a bit broader with a select number of participants. And for better or for worse, when you get to common understanding, it's easier to move forward. So I think that that's some of the Canada story.
But if you go beyond Canada, is that a fair comment, do you think?
I think so, because ultimately any trade or any transaction that happens, irrespective whether it is securities or otherwise, it all ends up finally in some cash transaction. So whether it is a retail side of it or institutional side of it or corporate side of it. So given that ultimately it results in a debit and a credit on an account, so the intent to adopt newer technologies, the appetite to do it is always there. And ultimately people who are worried about cash and then they want the cash in their account faster, sooner and secured. So in that sense, I think the appetite to adopt newer technologies is higher in the payment side than anywhere else.
So, Andreas, you were referring to new technologies there, so that including blockchain, but not limited to that. Are all these new technologies pulling in the same direction? So the kinds of things that you see on the Sibos program, AI, big data, blockchain, APIs, whatever, are there choices to be made there, or should you be running with all of them?
So ultimately, I think, from my perspective, it's about instantaneous settlement, right? Whether it is in the cash side of it or anything else. So as long as, technologies are facilitating towards instantaneous debits and credits, which is secured and transparent, people would go for it.
Okay, Chris, Digital Asset is a go-to firm for a lot of market infrastructures and banks when it comes to distributed ledger projects. Without going through the full list of everything that you're engaged in, is there a way of distinguishing between those projects which are more advanced than others, so have gone beyond proof of concept and people will see something soon, and those which maybe are in early stages but are going to have a bigger impact on the market as a whole?
Absolutely, there is that distinction. As you quite rightly say, Digital Asset is a software company using distributed ledger technologies. We use the F word a lot at Digital Asset, and that's that we're very focused. We're very focused on the market infrastructure space. So in terms of lots of projects, we have a good pipeline. We're working with a large number of market infrastructures and banks, but it's not a vast number because we want to be very focused. Partly because we want to deliver on the promise of distributed ledger. And there are a number of projects that are in the public domain that we've talked about. One is actually with SIX and with Tom's organisation. One is with the DTCC. But probably to answer your question, which is the one that's the most advanced? It's the one. It's the ASX project. ASX were very courageous quite some time ago. If you think, when did you first start hearing about blockchain and distributed ledger technologies? We've been on a journey with the ASX now for a couple of years. They've been a fabulous partner, and they've made a very bold and courageous decision to evaluate this technology as a potential to replace their CHESS, their clearing and settlement system for cash equities. And just to be completely transparent, they haven't made that decision, but they're looking very closely at that, and we've been working very well with them to literally take out the CHESS system and replace what is a top 10 systemically consequential market infrastructures clearing and settlement engine and replace it with DLT. That is, I think, probably the most advanced project that's in the market infrastructure space. It's certainly the most advanced project that we've got. And this isn't a secret at all, but they will be making a decision towards the end of the year as and how to progress and move forward with that project. If indeed they do decide to do that, I think that's going to be a very big moment, not just for digital asset, not just for ASX, but also for this industry, because a lot of people are saying, well, hang on a second, I heard about this thing called blockchain. I've heard about this distributed ledger thing. I've heard all of these benefits, but does it really work? And can you put it into production? Can you get all the stakeholders involved that need to be involved? For example, the ASX are involved in a very wide, broad-scale engagement with their stakeholders, and those stakeholders from the government through to their regulators, central bank, and of course their community. So it's a very extensive program, and I think will be very beneficial, not just to the obvious stakeholders in that, but also to the industry, because everybody's looking to see, well, is this stuff really going to work in a production in a systemically consequential market? And I think that could well be a milestone that will be very positive for banks, financial institutions who are going, okay, this can work, as well as for those who are providing services around it.
So in fact, that covers both angles. It's both advanced and likely to have a big impact on the industry. But Tom, as a CSD, I mean, you've obviously got an innovation lab in-house and you look at what's happening. Is there anything concrete that you can yet put in your forward planning that's DLT-based?
I think before I answer that, I'd like to take a step back. You had asked the question about whether the different technologies are converging or whether they're diverging. And I think we need to take a step back and think not about the technology and then what's the problem that we're trying to solve, but the other way around, start at the end of the process, what is the desired outcome? And then which of the technologies is the most appropriate one for that? And it may be legacy, it may be AI or elements of that, it may be elements of robotics, it may be blockchain. The key is we've got to look at, if we take the entire process, but we don't look at automating the process through the various steps, because that process is somewhere between 30 and 50 years old, and we've modified it over the years. We may have optimized it a little bit. We've certainly made it more complicated as a result of regulatory inputs and so on. If we start at the end with the desired outcome and then start looking backwards, we can assess whether that process is still correct and then decide what is the most appropriate technology. Now, taking that as the background, yes, we're prototyping a DLT solution in the corporate action and data scrubbing space. We're in a proof of concept phase around a DLT solution for a derivative CSD and settlement system, but it's still early days. And now specifically to your question, is there anything that's actually producing a real added value yet? The answer is no, not yet. But I think it's important that we go through these steps to understand the technology, understand in particular the dependencies to the other technologies we have, and then how do we integrate that with the various legacy systems that we will continue to have going forward for some time.
Richard, if I can just build on that, a lot of people come to us and say, can I do this with a blockchain and a distributed ledger technology? Just as there are other technologies that you were talking about, cloud, AI, machine learning, etc. And to Tom's point, you've got to pick the right technology. You've also got to pick the right business case. And one of the qualifying, when we focus in on an opportunity, it's quite frankly, what is your business case in English, not the technology? And then why have you tried to solve this without using blockchain technology? Because a lot of people want to sort of play with the technology and use it to experiment, which is fine and interesting, but the last place you want to get to is a place where you're using this technology just because it's in vogue at the moment, but in actual fact, you've probably got a bunch of other legacy systems that actually may be able to solve that problem. So to Tom's point, yes, look at, is it the right technology, but also when you're looking very specifically at blockchain or DLT, make sure that use case is leveraging those core components of the immutability, the distributed, the shared components, a single source of truth. Otherwise, you may not be picking the right technology.
I'd like to actually come back to what Tom said about starting at the end and the desired outcome. Is that happening in the industry, or was that an implicit criticism of the way of something that needs to change in the way the industry approaches change?
Is that a question for me?
It's
It's a difficult one to answer
Yeah.
because I don't know what others are doing. I think there's a natural tendency to look at what is there today and how can we do it better, rather than looking at what is there today and why the heck are we doing it at all. Because that raises a whole series of other potentially uncomfortable questions around who is doing what in this whole ecosystem and should we be doing it.
Glenn, you wanted to
So
comment on that?
I was going to say that, when you look at the future and to take that point about looking at the future space and saying, so we were just having the conversation, at what point do we start talking about the blockchain of things and where does that fit into? And I don't think we're there yet. The conversation is that we understand that this technology is very powerful, but understanding the wide-ranging applications and how it's going to fit. But what we can do and what we can do and the stuff that we worry about is understanding that change is going to happen. And that change is inevitable from our perspective, and it's not how the change is going to happen, but we are being driven faster, cheaper, and safer every day. And that's the service we provide as post-trade infrastructure. So faster, cheaper, safer. And when we look at the role we play in the marketplace, if we want to continue playing the role, we have to think in that paradigm. And then we get back to that question around technology and what technology helps us to do that. But we're all making investments in this space with that thought, that thought lens looking forward.
So, if, NGS, you have experience of getting big systems and infrastructures to move, to change. How do you do that? How easy is it to get a whole market that's based on a particular platform at the center to lift it out and introduce something else?
I still have some hair left. So I think it's any transformation program is complex, right? If you try and ignore what I call as heritage, right? What you have, I don't use the word legacy, but I always prefer to use the word heritage, right? That heritage systems has so much of contextual knowledge in it, right? And one can't ignore that, right? Because there is so much that has gone into it. They continue to be making money. And it's unfortunate that people call it business as usual, but day in and day out, what people managing those heritage systems do is plan for the business unusual over there, right? So it's in that context, you can't ignore what is there. So if you want to move into anything new, it's so important to understand the contextual knowledge. It's so important to go and look at what's exactly happening in the technology side of it, operation side of it. What are the pain points that they have? Take that contextual knowledge and then see how you want to take that contextual knowledge into the new platform that we're building, right? And before you do that, we all know what does it take to roll out technology in the financial industry, right? So will it scale? Is it secured? Is it something that's capable of multi-time zone, multi-market, multi-this, multi-that, right? So in order to, I think, the first thing that I will do is that get that contextual knowledge, spend sufficient time, and don't ignore the team that is actually doing it, see how we can bring them in. Second is get the architecture right on the new platform, and then see how you connect the bridge between these two. In that way, I found that it's a very good way to de-risk any transformation program.
Does that include getting the people ready? I mean, it sounds from some of the comments that I've heard that although people talk about technology being driven by customer demand or whatever, actually the technologies may be ready before the people are ready to adopt it. Is that something that's a challenge at the start of any change process at the center?
So we've just gone through a very successful T+2 implementation in Canada. A large program involving all of our stakeholders. The technology piece was insignificant in terms of the amount of change. The work was in the changing behaviors, changing process, and having a common understanding, common goals, and common acceptance of timelines. And so when we're talking about the implementation of change in a broader scheme of things, I think it happens in two ways. Either you have broad-based consensus demand, either artificially created or genuine demand, where you have consensus among stakeholders to move forward, or it's going to happen in bits and pieces around you. And the smaller pieces of the value chain throughout the stack, from a business perspective, not from a technology perspective, from a business perspective, the little bits and pieces are going to change over time, somewhat out of the control, somewhat random, and it'll be technology aided or business aided, and that's how that change will happen.
But how do you then deal with the problem of having to run what you had before, legacy or heritage, and introduce new stuff without increasing the costs of the whole enterprise?
Well, I don't think there's any way to do it without increasing the cost for a period of time. Inevitably, if you're making these investments, and that's a part of the business decision. So when you're making a change in general, and a business case will include, an acknowledgement that you have to maintain legacy infrastructure for a period of time as you're adapting to new technology. We're in the middle of a major program to replace our entire clearing, settlement, depository infrastructure right now. 2-year, 3-year program that is starting. And a big part of that business case and decision is an acknowledgement that we have to run legacy systems for a period of time as we're doing the implementation. But that's just a project that has to be. I don't want to say it's just work, but it is just work. That's not the most challenging part of these things.
I don't think that's really new to new technology. That's the standard way of doing stuff. One of the things that we're certainly taking into consideration for a potential rollout in Australia is de-risking the whole process. So back in the day when I was living a long time ago, there were things called big bangs, and there's no way you do a big bang with this technology now. What you do is you roll it out in a very phased way. And you roll it out in a phase where, so for example, take any market infrastructure, there will be some of the participants in that market infrastructure who want to grab at this technology because they see the benefits, they see the savings, the efficiencies, et cetera, et cetera. And there'll be other participants that operate on or with a market infrastructure who say, you know what, I'm this big. Are those benefits? I don't see those big benefits. Please don't disrupt my life. Please don't shake me up, and let me just get on with my life. So we are certainly architecting our solution where the market operator can offer up to the big players a solution that they can take at their pace, but there will also be the option for those, let's call them mum and pop shops, the smaller firms who just say they'll just carry on as they were doing before. Now, they won't get all the benefits, of course, but they also haven't taken the plunge to move into this technology. So that's one of the ways that you can de-risk the rollout of this solution. Doesn't mean to say there won't be parallel testing, et cetera, but it's how you de-risk the solution.
Tom?
I think if I can expand on Glenn's point, the very important point he made was you have to have the dialogue with the client and have a common goal with the client, and they have to understand why you're doing it. At the end of the day, our clients don't particularly care what technology we use. They really don't. They want to see a service. They're paying us for the service, not for whatever the infrastructure is behind it. Now, that doesn't mean that we shouldn't get more efficient. It doesn't mean that we shouldn't provide additional functionality, but it's that functionality that they're paying for. If we have the dialogue with the client and they understand what we're doing, usually they will be quite comfortable with the process you have to go through to do it. We've seen in the past that there are market infrastructures that do an annual upgrade that really only serves themselves, and the market has to each year plan on making substantial changes to their interfaces and so on. That upsets them a great deal. That is not something you want to be doing, and yet there are still infrastructures that do that. So that issue of the dialogue and understanding the value of what you're doing and having a common goal is the only way you're going to have a successful implementation. And again, whether it's with a new technology or an adaptation of the old, they don't care.
I'd completely,
Chris, you're
completely
nodding
agree.
your head.
If you look
Yeah.
at what the ASX is doing, they're in a very, very broad consultation with their community saying, this is what we're doing, this is how we're going to be doing it. And at some point, hopefully they will get the community comfortable with that by illustrating the benefits and the service that Tom refers to. One of the reasons that we're focused on market infrastructures is because not only they are trusted, the center of a market, they're trusted because of the position that they hold for the running of the market. They're also trusted because they've got people in those organizations who will make decisions about this technology, and they will work with the community, their community, but at the end of the day, their community will look to that market infrastructure to say, is this right for you and for us as market participants? And that's why we think that market infrastructures are a very sensible way to start this journey, because of the trusted position that market infrastructures have.
But even given that trusted position, from what you were saying earlier, would it be fair to assume that lift and shift is not the model for changing market infrastructure? Because
So lift and shift doesn't exist in my lexicon. It's systemically important market infrastructure. That's not an option available to us. And in the role we play in terms of the core functioning of the capital markets, we have to be much more thoughtful. Not that lift and shift can't be thoughtful, but it generally would be perceived as being less than thoughtful if we were to take that approach.
Europe's just gone through a multi-year market infrastructure change, T2S. Are there any lessons from that, from the way it was done, not necessarily the project itself or what it set out to do, that is useful for other projects of market infrastructure change? Either good or bad lessons? Anyone want to?
Well, I think there are parallels. If one of our biggest challenges was not actually developing the links to T2S and the various process changes, it was in fact bringing the client base along that journey and having them understand what it meant for them. T2S was one of those projects where we could not define exactly what the client experience ultimately was going to look like, because it was very simply mandated how it was going to work. So it had an impact on clients, and we had to spend time working with them to bring them along on that journey. Ultimately, those markets that had delays, I think a lot of those delays were because market participants were not ready, not necessarily that the infrastructure itself was incapable of implementing.
From a technology perspective or a process perspective, I think a lot of things were done on that program on a much larger scale, too many stakeholders. But from a participant's ability to join the service quickly, one could have thought through a kind of a migration or a transition bridge, right? By which, even if they are not ready, then they are not delayed. How can they continue to send it in old format, for example? And I still continue to accept the old format. And the intent is to get them on board and be a change agent or facilitate the change of migration. There are technologies today that permits that essentially, it's supporting two different versions in the same system, right? And it's quite possible, and I think in SIX, time and again we have done that, right? I think, we have seen them doing that, right? Supporting multiple versions of the message formats at any point in time. So that could be one lesson for me, if I were to support some of the banks or participants in a particular market, now I would go and probably build a migration bridge for them and then facilitate. Doesn't matter, you can take your time to change it, but I'll continue to support it.
That question of a migration bridge also something that's come up in discussions that I heard yesterday on when it comes to blockchain, how do you get all the different initiatives to align so that you've got some kind of standardization? And there was a suggestion that custodians and possibly market infrastructures could act as sort of middleware to make these systems interoperate. So it's not necessary to have a big global standardization effort. I've actually noticed that I've written muddleware instead of middleware, but that's a Freudian slip. Is there enough attention paid to how to get everyone on the same page in terms of developing new technologies, and particularly blockchain? I mean, obviously, with the new technology, the competitive boundaries are not so obvious.
So I think there's a couple of things. First of all, there will not be one distributed ledger platform, I don't think in my lifetime, that will rule the world. It just isn't going to happen. I think people are reminiscent of what happened in the 80s and 90s, and they want competition, and what will emerge will be ledgers, distributed ledgers, providers of platforms who typically focus in a particular area, just as some focus in trade finance, some focus in payments, some focus in market infrastructures and securities. And each of those will build their own strength and their own beachheads. At some point, there will be a need for those to interoperate. And interoperate comes at a number of levels. The most simplistic one is the ability to be able to communicate back and forth with each of them. Similarly, I don't think that will be, whatever that piece of technology is that links them together, and we have some ideas, will not be allowed to be owned by somebody, just as TCP/IP is not owned by somebody and who's allowed to make commercial benefit off of it. It's clear from the people that we speak to, and it's also clear of the people that I compete with, the platform providers that we compete with, that everybody realizes that this interoperability is a challenge that everybody wants to solve in the fullness of time, because they don't want to get into a situation where there are all these different silos that don't talk to one another. The practical reality is we are in a race at the moment, and although it's an important item for the firm I work for, it's also important for us to get delivery of some of these projects that I've talked about. But I do think there will be interoperability of ledgers, because there is so much benefit that will be gained for the market participants, for the vendors, and services that can be created off of it. How exactly that happens, we have some ideas, but it's still early days, and I think those ideas will probably not be owned by any one person. And I think that all the ledgers, the distributed ledger providers, will, certainly what they're saying right now is we'll embrace that because they see it's beneficial to have that connectivity.
I think the phrase that you used, in the fullness of time, gives some idea of the priority that people have on standardization.
Well, just to be clear, it is a priority. It is a priority for us, but there are other priorities. So it is definitely something that's strategically out there that needs to get done. So we actually have people working on it. So I don't want to dismiss it as just punting it down the road. It is something that is very important. And the whole business is
another element as regards blockchain. Sorry if I interrupt. There is not yet a fully functioning blockchain in the securities post-trade space that we can point to. So I think it would be nice to get one that actually works, to where we can all kick the tires on and say,
absolutely,
that thing actually works, and now let's look at what do we learn out of it, what can we use elsewhere.
Tom. And I think there's a lot of people worrying about standardizations. This conference is a big chunk of it is around standards, but it's still early days for that. And I was watching a panel this morning, as one of the Swift Standards panels, and somebody was making the point that we should talk about it and be starting to think about it, but how can you start putting standards in until we actually know what is going to be the end game here? And in fact, they gave an example of some technology where standards were imposed. People spent a lot of money imposing those standards, but that didn't end up being the technology that prevailed. And so, yes, we need to talk about it, but we also just need to be careful about imposing standards too early before the right technology emerges.
Is this something that should also be part of what Tom was saying about what is the end goal that you want, and then working backwards? Glenn, did you?
So I'll just say that, from a non-technologist, this does just seem to be work, and so it's kind of a funny topic talking about standards here at Swift. I hope the Swift police aren't going to kick us out for talking about no need for standards, and we'll figure this out. But it seems to be As a non-technologist, obviously there's some work involved. So it's creative work and safe, sound, secure. But I do think the reason it's being punted down the road a bit is because people understand that's a very solvable problem if and when we get there. And so to solve it up front detracts from the real work of saying, and the real work because some of us are racing to implement, to move from proof of concept into actual working applications because of competitive pressures. We want to be, to provide solutions as well as business solutions. We want to be perceived as providing those solutions, and worrying about those standards themselves it gets in the way of our practical reality of running businesses at the same time. So I think that the role for post-trade infrastructure providers, and I think you were going down this path. What do we do? And a lot of this work that's going on is literally looking at a lot of the value chain inside of what we do as in the businesses that we run, and that's what I was referring to, the bits and pieces, the value chain that are being that as people have told me that I'm going to be roadkill at some point unless I'm self-disrupting. I think that's not highly accurate in one way or the other. There's a role we're going to play, but it's going to be a different role in the future in terms of the infrastructure.
Tom?
I think there's another thing we got to think about when we talk about standards as it relates to blockchain or any IT. Is that really the issue? We don't have standards in collateral modeling. We don't have standards in corporate action processing. We don't have standards in tax processing. If we want to get cost out of our system generally, we should be pushing on those elements. And yet politically, that's a very difficult thing to do, certainly in Europe. The standards aren't there. And I think there are going to be just as many solutions on a technology front for addressing operational issues as there are difficulties in terms of the processes that we all accommodate in our daily business.
That actually leads nicely, if a little bit obliquely, onto the question of scale. I mean, all of these initiatives we're talking about are essentially to try and improve efficiency and drive down cost. So the industry's way of dealing with driving down cost in the post-trade world so far has been scale. Get the unit cost down, get more volume onto the system. Is there still life in that process? Or is that reaching a state of diminishing return? Tom, would you like to?
In the current heritage or legacy environment, I think it's limited. I think there are regulatory impediments to getting onto common platforms. There are platform constraints in general to do that. And the idea of just jamming more transactions onto a fairly monolithic legacy or heritage platform and bringing unit costs down isn't going to get us where we need to go. We're already in an environment where the unit cost is relatively low for post-trade. We're investing more and more in unproductive functionality, risk management, compliance issues, and so on. None of that generates additional revenue. Those add on to our fixed costs and makes it very difficult to get scale in the traditional sense of just jamming more transactions onto a platform. I think we've got to redefine what scale means and where the costs in the overall ecosystem are, and then start examining how we take that out.
So before we come on to that, NGS, do you have an IT perspective on that?
I think I agree with Tom from a market infrastructure perspective, absolutely true. And the heritage systems, you need to, as I said, it's business unusual is what we are planning in there. And yes, there are some cognitive technologies, there are some automation technologies that are coming in by which we can keep pushing the envelope of STP from 95% STP to 96%, 97%, which is okay. But on the other side, if I look at the markets participant side of it, right? is there an industry utility? Is there a common shared service for securities processing per se, right? That's an area where it's been a lot of discussions that have happened in the industry. Number of large banks have, everyone believes that by putting more volumes and then we can actually make it happen. But then, at least I have been part of 2-3 times so far in bringing some of this together in Europe and elsewhere. But the key issue seems to be that it's just not the transactions. That it's a business case wise, it's no rocket science. It comes out very well, very cleanly. But then the question is, what we call is there a first mover disadvantage there? That question keeps coming, right? And are we making the efficiencies of an efficient bank? Are we transferring it to an inefficient bank, right? So that question comes in. Be that as it may, I think when people are really worried about is how do I transition or migrate into that utility, right? That migration and transition efforts or integration efforts is huge, and that's something that's bothering them. In that context, most of them tended to believe that, look, no, I'm okay to join an utility. My platform is proven, which works in 96 markets, 100 markets. So why don't you adopt my platform as an utility, right? Utility platform. And then it gives probably, and the other party immediately feels that, no, your platform may be good for US, but my platform is better for Europe. So that, and a lot of capitalization has taken place, and with the result that it's really not going anywhere. But however, on the positive side of it, what we have come up with is, what is the scope of the utility? Or what is the scope of the shared service? What are considered core? What is considered value-added services? These are biggest learnings that we have got out of that, right? From my perspective, I think, and then there are questions around, if I move it into a shared service or a utility, am I cannibalizing my transaction bank, right? These are questions that people ask, and these are all the deterrents that we see in bringing large banks together in coming up for an industry-wide shared utility. In the meantime, my one opinion is that, look, the whole initial setup cost for an utility from an infrastructure perspective or a technology perspective is coming down because of the cloud advancements, because of the variabilized cost structures we have on the systems per se. So the initial setup cost, I believe, is much, much lower than what it was in our business case 2 years back, right? So I am of the opinion that, look, we should perhaps look at mid-sized banks with such a variable cost available. Maybe it makes sense for the mid-sized banks to come into this, or a full-service universal banks who are not the big ones to come into this. And to me, I don't think that scale is necessary to provide a competitive service. I believe a competitive service is quite feasible by adopting a cloud technology and a variabilized cost structures of today and make it cost competitive, number one, right? Number two is that, look, as you mature that, maybe, one or two of these large banks will join and evolve it into a utility. This is potentially an option, right? Because of the complexities that we see on the other side of the equation.
So there are still ways to bring costs down using cloud, for example, or other technologies. But what if scaling up is not the answer? What is it that you have to address to reduce costs in the future? Glenn.
So the focus on costs, and I don't want to diminish, sort of the role of costs in our business model, but I would argue that generally speaking, our costs are well managed today. And it's while we continue to focus on costs and providing value through the services we provide, we do look at the technology and technology change more from a business opportunity perspective than from a cost reduction. And the business opportunity may be more efficient services, it may be faster to market, it may be more agile. But when we're looking at technology decisions today, clearly we expect to have cost. We're generally not paying more for technology today. It's not the way this is working. We're paying less, getting more for less, or getting the same for less. either as a result of evolution in technology. We're dealing with vintage systems. This is not a big lift for us. So, COBOL-based mainframes and moving to something today it's a pretty straightforward. The next iteration is going to be more challenging in terms of that cost. That's why when I'm saying I'm not as focused on cost, I have a big cost sort of piece of work that's being done right now, but my future technology decisions will be less cost-driven and more business-driven in terms of what value can I get out of my technology decision to support the marketplace more broadly.
Tom?
I think the issue of costs in the post-trade space is it needs to be redefined. If we look at the overall value chain, our clients are an integral part of that, as are their clients. And the major part of the cost that we see is not my platform and what does that cost and what does that mean as part of the transaction fee that I pass on to my client. The cost is the level of duplication we have in the system. Every single booking we do gets done again by our client, gets done by his client, and ultimately by the end client. That's crazy. The amount of anti-money laundering work, KYC work, and so on gets done over and over and over again. Corporate actions are processed over and over and over again. That cost needs to be taken out, and I think the only way to do this and really get systemic cost out is to think quite differently about what the entire value chain is and start looking at what roles do each of the players in that value chain take. To NGS's point, where is the baseline that a market infrastructure plays, and what role do the various other intermediaries play in that ecosystem?
Chris, has this question of duplication come up in the ASX context?
Yes. I want to just shift the debate a little bit. We're talking a lot about cost, and I think if the first generation of the technology, certainly the blockchain technology, a lot of it is focused on a cost saving for you're not double booking, you're not doing the reconciliation, the transparency that comes from that can help with the reporting. A lot of it's around risk reduction and it's around cost, which is great, and that's a good place to start. But the journey for this is going to quite quickly evolve, because as people get to understand this technology, be it in the market infrastructure or in a bank, they will realize just how powerful this technology is, and they'll have insights way broader than the vendors who are bringing these to market in terms of the opportunities that exist with their own business. And you will see not just the business driver for this being about cost saving and risk reduction, it will be about the generation and the creation of new services. So just as when the World Wide Web, the internet, 1990s was being rolled out, we were doing a number of things on it, making efficient email, looking at blogs, et cetera, It was quite some time later that the sort of Uber-type adventure happened, and people back in the 90s couldn't have envisaged the Uber thing, partly because there were some other technologies that needed to get rolled out, but the web quite quickly moved from something you looked at to something that you did commerce on. And right now, and you made money off the back of, and we haven't got there yet. People haven't figured out how to make money off of this yet. Well, I should say they haven't. Some people are playing with it, have figured that out, and will no doubt that's where we'll end up going. But if you think about the single source of truth, you think about that single source of truth is distributed. It starts to bring a whole stack of different revenue generating services, and that's where this conversation will get really interesting, because people running businesses, cost saving, it's something that we all have to do on a regular basis, and optimization, but what grows business is not cost saving. What grows business is creating new products and services and revenue generating services. And I don't want to suggest that we have the answer to that, but once you put these platforms in place, you'll be a lot closer to figuring that out. And that's what we'll be talking about in Sibos 2022 or whatever, is the revenue generating services that get put in place. By then there'll be a number of platforms laid down with a number of viable working use cases.
Does that mean that it's too early to think about Glenn's phrase earlier, roadkill? People thinking themselves, is it too early to figure out, to say these guys?
Who are the winners and losers
Yeah.
in this space? I don't think it's ever too early to start thinking about it. I think it might be too early to declare who's going to be roadkill and who's not.
I think if you look at some of the people who are embracing this technology early on, it's because they wonder what the hell is going to happen to my business. Because the beginning of this story was, back 2008 was when we want to have something that's got nothing to do with central banks, nothing to do with governments. Now that's ironically flipped, where this very technology is being used to help central banks and to help market infrastructures and to help banks. But I think in that process there was a rhetoric that said, and this institution is going to be killed, and this institution is going to be killed. None of which, by the way, my firm subscribed to, but it did get a lot of people going, maybe there is something in this. Maybe we are going to get killed. We are going to be roadkill. And I think it inspired a lot of people to dig a lot deeper into what does this really mean. And in the process of that digging, they said, we're probably not going to be out of business, but our business is going to change, and we better make sure that we're controlling our destiny before somebody else changes it.
Right, I'd like to now open the floor to questions. Is there anyone with any questions? There'll be a mic coming around, so if you could put your hand up. Yeah. Rob.
It's very clear there's a need for transformation. It's very clear that blockchain technologies can play a big part in that. I guess the question is, though, if you look at and it's also very courageous of ASX to be a pioneer in that, for sure. The question I've got, though, is if that implements, let's just assume that there's a successful implementation of blockchain technology. Is it going to be considered a success if the next 10, 15 years, the benefit they derive from a cost or efficiency or risk or whatever is not passed back, if it's not mandated? And, they spend the next 10, 15 years taking all that benefit, commercial benefit, to, service the translation layers that their clients will have.
Rob, are you posing that question to anyone in particular? Or?
Anyone can take it.
Yeah.
So on behalf of my friends in Australia, because they have a similar business model to us, for-profit institution running infrastructure with a public good and a public utility function as well that's highly regulated, making a substantive investment in a technology to the benefit of the community, but importantly a benefit to ASX as well in terms of the running of that technology. The question around fees and the passing on fees with respect to our participants in that value chain is always going to be a difficult question, especially in the for-profit market infrastructure space, where we have to recognize that we have a public interest mandate as well as a shareholder mandate as well. I would temper the savings never getting passed on, because that's in any material piece of time, because our business environments are tempered with a regulatory environment that is fostering competition. I would suggest first mover advantage with any of these technology adventures is going to be limited. I would think that if you took that world where that there was an adoption, a successful adoption, a powerfully successful adoption in the Australian experience, that would probably get replicated fairly quickly in the business environment, both in Australia and around the world, which would change that dynamic. So I think that in the world where you have competitive forces that are allowed to work, that tempers the risk that you see around infrastructure providers having monopoly rent as a result of some of these decisions. It's a difficult question. We deal with it every day.
I want to avoid making any commentary about the fees that the ASX will or will not charge. I think you handled that question, answered that very, very, very neatly. Let me just shift it a little bit to say, regardless of what the ASX does in terms of its own fee structure, the rolling out of this type of technology, if they decide to make that decision, will lead to a situation where all of the participants in the ASX will be operating off of a ledger or a single source of truth. And by putting that structure in place, all those that connect to it will see savings in their very own operations through reconciliation. So irrespective of what happens to the ASX fees, they may go up, they may go down, it's not for me to comment, but there will, I believe, be significant savings to the participants who will be operating with the ASX in a far more efficient manner by leveraging this distributed, shared, single source of truth that will make their processing and efficiencies much easier. Just by the very nature of the reconciliation savings, they will save a lot of money. I was reading a report somewhere, I forget who it was, who said that just the market infrastructure alone, savings from reconciliation, in the billions of dollars that would be saved. And you throw out a number like 10 billion in a conference, that doesn't sound like a lot, but you know what? It's a significant saving, and I think that's one of the messages that that the participants in the ASX market are hearing, that there's the opportunity for them to save money in their own operations.
Tom, does that sound like one way of dealing with the issue of duplication that you raised earlier?
It's potentially one way of dealing with it. I think it's still a little too early to say that is a solution. But I think coming back to Rob's question and broadening it out a little bit, how do we define whether it's a successful implementation? I think it'll come down to some of the points made earlier by both Chris and Glenn and NGS about instant payments. We see there's a trend in the market that the end investor and the various stakeholders in the middle, whether it's an asset management firm or a pension fund, whatever it is, wants more transparency, wants directer lines of communication, wants quicker implementations, a quicker time to market on new functionality. That will define whether the technology is considered to be a success or not. I think the issue of cost is an important one, but I think in the first instance, that has to happen in parallel anyway. With using that's not necessarily in the first instance a technology dialogue. That's a process dialogue and roles and to some extent regulatory. But next to that, you have the ability to today already mobile payments and so on. It's a much more direct line between the end client and a payment infrastructure. And I think the same will happen in the securities world. It will be demanded, and that will determine whether it's successful or not.
Any other questions? Monica, there's a mic coming.
The question is for Tom. Tom, do you think that CSDs that are not vertically integrated are at a higher risk of being able to implement this new world technology on the basis that it goes peer-to-peer and therefore we don't really deal with the investors? Meaning the CSDs that are not vertically integrated don't have access, they're just a very big intermediary. And do you see that as I see it?
I don't think you can put that purely at the feet of a CSD that is not vertically integrated. I think the issue of collaboration is there irrespective of what today's position of a market infrastructure is. And the dialogue with its clients will determine how far you go, and that dialogue has to be held. So I don't, if I understood your question correctly, I don't think a non-vertically integrated infrastructure is a greater or lesser risk. You could make an argument either way. You can close a silo and be completely disintermediated by a number of big banks that then set up their own networks and their own blockchain if they wanted to. So I don't think it's an issue that's related to the structure of the infrastructure. The important thing is that collaboration is happening to get to the end client and deliver a service that actually adds value, not just to the next intermediary in the chain, but a couple steps further back.
Who's the end client in your mind?
The end client will be ultimately the retail investor. And they're the ones that our clients, the banks, have to service.
We've got, I don't know if any of you know the Radio 4 show in the UK, Just a Minute, where you have to speak for a minute without hesitation, repetition, or deviation. We've got 45 seconds. Does anyone want to take up the challenge of a closing comment from the panel? Anything we haven't covered that you'd want to leave on the table, Glenn?
Yeah.
We don't have buzzers, so.
Sure, I'll take the challenge. So from infrastructure providers, our roles are going to change. They'll be changing because of the business and the business around us, not because of a want or a need to play with new technology. So this is going to happen around us, and you will see us evolve in the roles and responsibilities that we have in the marketplace, with and without that new technology.
And spot on.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.